Increased temperature and sea levels, changing precipitation patterns, and more extreme weather are threatening food and water security, human health and safety, as well as socio-economic development on the African continent. The United Nations and major international bodies over the years have taken several commitments to curb the nefarious effects of climate change, but the situation remains disturbing. The recent COP27 summit, which ended in Egypt, set a renewed path towards climate action in the world. But can Africa move from policies to implementation? If yes, how can this be achieved? Our guest has the answers to these questions and more. Stay with us. Our guest is a seasoned climate and environmental expert whose knowledge encompasses programming and policy on regional and global issues of climate change, environmental management, sustainable development, clean energy, resource efficiency, and food security to foster accelerated economic growth. He has won many awards, including the 2020 African Green Champion Award, the 2016 African Environmental Heroes Award, and the 2016 United Nations Environmental Programme Highest Recognition Award on Program Innovation. With a PhD in Environmental Change and Policy from the University of Nottingham in the United Kingdom, plus an executive certificate on climate change and energy policy from Harvard Kennedy School in the United States, he has participated in various research projects and published over 500 articles in international peer-reviewed journals and magazines. In 2009, he joined the United Nations Environmental Programme as a Climate Change Adaptation and Development Policy Coordinator for Africa, where he steered the body's climate resilience strategy. And since the year 2022, he's been promoted to the Deputy Regional Director for Africa at the United Nations Environmental Programme. Join me to welcome Dr. Richard Munang. He joins us live from Nairobi in Kenya. Dr. Richard Munang, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you very much for having me, Peter. I mean, it's a great pleasure to be on your show, and I look forward to our discussions on this very important topic.
The world is experiencing ecological degradation with droughts and floods in various parts of the globe. How disturbing is the situation in Africa?
Very important question, highly disturbing. In addition to the floods we saw in South Africa, there were floods in Nigeria, floods in Chad, Cameroon included, and droughts in East of Africa, where over 22 million people have been affected. So the reality of climate change is dawning on citizens of the continent today. And so it's no longer an abstract issue. And because of this, then the question moves to what needs to be done, which I think is the most important reality now. And when you look at what needs to be done, something is being done by communities. They are looking for alternatives to put food on the table and money in their pocket, but they need support. And that support needs to come from government, development partners, and even individual citizens. And that means that we need to start looking at how do we address those challenges in a way that creates socio-economic opportunities, that put food on the table and more money in more pockets and create jobs for our youth, who are, as we speak today, over 60% unemployed. And so climate change, challenge, a disguised opportunity. And that should actually be the focus at the moment.
Doctor, when we talk about Africa, so much attention is on the Horn of Africa, where for over 3 seasons, rain has been hard to come by. Severe drought is the order of the day. What really is causing these severe environmental conditions, and how badly are the people affected?
Climate change is with us to stay and is only going to get worse. Why? When you look at the entire global architecture of actions being taken to reduce emissions, it's quite not moving at the same pace in which the impacts of climate change are happening. And the drought in the Horn of Africa today, as you've rightly mentioned, is as a result of a changing climate and scientifically linked to it. Because of that, without lowering emissions, then the droughts are going to continue. But the issue is there are ways in which we can be able to put not only strategies, but actions in place to reduce the impacts of drought and the impacts of floods. And this entails working with nature, not against nature, simple environmental actions like agroforestry that most of our mothers in communities are practicing. Rainwater harvesting that could be tapped when there are rains downpour to be able to be used in irrigation. And this needs to become the norm, a national culture. Simple approaches like application of organic fertilizer and biofertilizer could actually restore the soil and ensure that water infiltration and also the soil chemical processes can be able to function even when there are droughts. But the big question is that these actions are happening in pockets. And the question then is, how do we bring this to scale? We need incentives, financial incentives. We need policy incentives that at least help ensure that resources get down to the people on the ground, but leveraging on structures that are accessible to the people, that when there are resources in terms of finance, this money should not just be given to individuals, should be given through structures like cooperatives. We call them tongtings in Cameroon or Jangis, where there are people who can then be able to access these resources and carry out actions that are climate resilient, climate friendly, to build their resilience and can be able to track. Because without using these accessible structures that most of African community actually have access to, we might not be able to actually get resources, get them to those who need it most to build climate resilience and carry out some of these simple actions that I've mentioned.
The fight against climate change has brought to light the debate on climate change research in Africa. Some observers say that climate change research in Africa is done with bias because most of the people investigating climate change issues on the continent are not living on the continent. Doctor, tell us, what's your take on that?
When there is a drought that kills a child in northern Kenya, in Turkana, that is evidence enough of a climatic change that is impacting life. It's not as a result of a researcher in Europe or in America that have done research to show that drought will happen. When there is a flood in northern Cameroon that washes away people's homes, that is not as a result of research that has been done in Germany or in Britain or in America. That is as a result of a climatic change that is visible to people. When there is crop failure in the northwestern part of Cameroon or in northern Nigeria or in southern Togo, and mothers and children don't have food to feed their kids, children don't have food to eat to go to school, that's evidence that our weather has changed. And therefore, to say that there is bias in research relating to climate change, to me, is to underestimate and somehow downplay an important issue that is visible to each and every one of us. And so there is nothing like black and white when it comes to research. Research is research and science help informs. It is therefore up to each and everyone to be able to pick the science to inform policy and put policies in place that can better people's lives. So to answer that in a nutshell, there is absolutely nothing like bias when it comes to science, because science is science. But it also provides an opportunity for African scientists to start to bring what I call contextual reality, which is that the issues of Southern Africa and Northern Africa and Central African region and Eastern Africa and Western Africa differ. Their climatic profiles are not the same. And also on top of that, the geographical and cultural perspective differ, which are also a strength for the continent. So African scientists need to start contextualizing reality within the scientific research and making this research applicable to leverage on already existing structures, like I mentioned, cooperatives, like I mentioned, governance structures that do exist and are in abundance in the continent, to make research relevant and also research channeled through those structures. That's where we're missing the piece of the pie. And so the bias, I would actually say, is from Africans who sometimes don't actually bring this to the table, but overarchingly, science doesn't discriminate.
Over the years, global powers have made commitments to cut greenhouse gas emissions in a bid to curb climate change, but the results on the ground is far from what is being made in the public offices, with Africa and other developed parts of the world calling for the loss and pay policy. Why are developed countries reluctant to live up to their climate change commitments?
The reality is that the debate on climate change is a political debate, and it's also a debate that actually is premised on economic growth and transformation. And if you look at the way that the world is structured, there are developed and developing countries. And the developed countries actually build the economies and grew to where they are today by depending on fossil fuels, which have resulted to the emissions that are seeing temperatures above 1.1 degree as we speak today. That then means the common but differentiated principle, which is part and parcel of the Paris Agreement and the convention, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that the polluters pay principle applies, see the debate and discourse on climate change sometimes not really a very straightforward or a straight line discussion. And that is expected in multilateralism. But what is the key here is that we should celebrate progress at bit small steps, where in 2015, the Paris Climate Change Agreement ensured that each and every country should put forward what was called the nationally determined contributions, which means countries put pledges to cut down their emissions. And what we've seen between that and now, the emissions gap report, which UNEP produces each and every year, shows that between now and 2050, emissions will be reduced down to 2.7%. Before the Paris Agreement, emissions were to hit about 4%. That means there's been progress. So we must appreciate progress to make progress. However, with the continuous opportunities and the shift towards clean energy solutions, the shift towards good enabling regulatory policy in clean solutions, like we're seeing e-mobility, e-transport, we're seeing clean energy solutions like solar being adopted by countries, and these are economic creating opportunities. Countries will start to coalesce because after COVID, economic distress happened not only to African countries, but to many countries. And the only way to build back, which UNEP emissions gap report in 2021 did show that if the build back resources are injected into clean energy climate action solutions, we could actually be able to cut emissions by 7.5%, but at the same time also create many jobs and opportunities. So as they see the opportunities, countries will start to move with speed.
All right, Doctor, let's look at the climate change policy in Africa. What's your take on the climate change policy in Africa? And do you think that there's something that can be done differently for these policies to become effective?
Excellent. So Africa is a leader when it comes to climate change. So 98% of all the countries, that's 52 out of 54, have ratified the Paris Climate Change Agreement. They've submitted the nationally determined contributions, and they are updating their climate plans, and 42% have already done so as we speak today. That's leadership. Where there is a big gap is to turn those policies into reality on the ground. The gap is with implementation. And therefore, without effective implementation, lives will not be saved. Without effective implementation, food insecurity issues that are being exacerbated by the changing climate will still continue. Droughts and floods will continue, plunging millions of people in suffering. So what needs to be done is African countries need to turn their climate action plan into what I call investment plans. Because as we speak today, up to 72% of African countries' climate plans have not been turned into investment plans. And so when you don't turn your climate plans into investment plans, then no investor will be attracted to invest in them. Before you buy something, for example, the seller will tell you what you are going to gain out of it. And that's when you remove your money, happily buying something, understanding that this is going to work for you. It's the same with climate plans. If there's a climate plan that, for example, in Cameroon, the indices are actually one of the best, among the best in the entire continent, to reduce emissions by up to 35% in the next 7 years. Excellent. Within it, there's decentralization of biogas to communities. Excellent. But those indices need to be shown that if you are to engage in biogas, in producing biogas, in installing digesters to produce biogas and biofertilizer, these are the returns on investment that you will make. There will be a lot of investors who are going to come in and put their money into that. So the process of these is very, very important. The second aspect is there needs to be what I call innovative financing. And innovative financing is that little resources that are gotten cannot just be used to drive any kind of action within a country. Those resources should be leveraged to de-risk already existing institutions like microfinance institutions, and again, cooperative, things and jangis, where the bulk of the population have access to. And those resources should be used to supercharge and provide a shot on the arm for those who do not have resources to be part of climate action solutions and take part in it and drive those who are already doing it. This way, we can be able to achieve a lot and build climate resilience, because at the end of the day, it's people who do development for themselves and it's people who implement climate action, but they need support. And sometimes the support is not just about money. It's also support in technical ideas, it's support in putting in place systems that can be able to support the structures that they already have. And this system is called blended finance, where government use the little resources they have, inject into cooperative, into microfinance, so that they can direct those who lend against any default to be able to drive transformational development. The third aspect that is important is youth skills retooling. Youth must be guided to retool their skill, and this should be integrated within every section of the school curriculum. From primary, secondary, high school, even university, climate entrepreneurship should become a compulsory subject for everybody, so that people can start to see the opportunities that they can tap into this. Emissions of Africa come from land-based actions, and these land-based actions are actually deforestation and agricultural production practices, sometimes that results to these emissions, application of chemicalized fertilizer, destroying the soil, resulting in lower harvests that result to people looking for more land to grow food. And the other aspect is that the food that is grown is lost. And so to be able to reduce emissions, we need to look at how do we ensure that the food that is produced by our mothers in communities get value added to it, because Africa loses 48 billion US dollars as a result of post-harvest losses. That is, the food that is produced is lost. So we end up not having food, we end up not having money. And so to be able to reduce that, we need simple, applicable climate action solutions like solar dryers that are decentralized to our mothers in communities, which through our work, we are working with young people to retool their skills, and they're actually decentralizing this. And this is helping reduce post-harvest losses, from the perspective that they're able to dry their cassava, dry their pumpkin, dry their vegetable, dry their beans. And even if there are no markets, it can last up to 6 months and they can still be able to find a market. That is one aspect. The second aspect is to take off people from depending on charcoal, which, as we speak today, over 700,000 Africans die as a result of indoor pollution, which comes as a result of depending on charcoal. And the alternative to charcoal, which will then reduce the impact of deforestation or the heavy reliance on fuel wood, will be to turn agricultural waste into fuel briquettes, which then replaces charcoal. That takes off the pressure from deforestation, it takes off the pressure from land, and then the emissions get reduced. And so looking at this is an opportunity from climate change, but that create jobs for young people, but also help reduce the emissions that Africa has. But just to say one thing here that is important, Africa emissions being negligible doesn't necessarily mean that Africa needs to increase the emissions, because the pathway of increasing emissions is not good for health. 700,000 Africans die because of indoor pollution. When you move to clean alternatives like biogas, like fuel briquettes, you will be saving lives and also at the same time taking off pressure from our environment. When you look at the opportunities like simple solar dryers that can reduce post-harvest losses, you are actually not only reducing post-harvest losses, but also creating opportunities for health, because most of the food is dried on the soil, on the ground. It gets affected by aflatoxin that result to causing cancer in many people. When you bring in clean energy solutions, you are bringing a health solution. You are bringing an energy solution. You are bringing a job creation solution. And therefore, the point is that Africa, being a negligible emitter, should be able to transition to what we call low emission development pathway, which is leveraging what doesn't provide emissions, what doesn't produce emissions, but instead provides opportunities.
From this discussion, I've been hearing how you've been citing the role of communities and how they can play a major role in the fight against climate change. But let's look at the African setting, where in the economy we have about 80% belonging to the informal sector. What role can they play in the climate change action?
The informal sector is the turbocharger of Africa's economies. They are the economic locomotive of Africa's transformational development. They are the ones at the forefront of climate change, yet they are also the ones who are doing what they can do in their own way to build climate resilience. Our mothers in villages today, who have never gone to school, use organic manure to grow vegetables, to grow greens and beans and other cabbages that fed us when we were growing up. They did not destroy it. They were working with the environment. That's action that needs to be taken up. Our mothers use what we call nature-based solutions, burying cassava and cocoyams underneath the earth, and they stay even for 3-4 weeks without getting spoiled. Those are preservation techniques that they use then, but they need incentives to uptake this. So the point here is that the informal sector is the entry and should be and must be the entry, that every action that is climate change related should tap on what they are doing and build on what they are doing, because when they are resilient and what they do is climate proofed. For example, a simple solar dryer decentralized to a mother in the northern part of Cameroon, or in the western part of Cameroon, or in the southern part or eastern part of Cameroon, or central part of Cameroon, will help them reduce their post-harvest losses. That will mean they will put food on the table and money in their pockets. That's resilience. What is resilience? When you are socioeconomically viable and there is a flood, you can relocate to another part and you can be able to afford to put food on the table and pay rents. That's resilience. Then when you are able to ensure that you can fetch a market, and that even if you don't have a market, what you produce is not going to get spoiled because you can be able to preserve it because you've dried it using a solar dryer. That's resilience. And therefore, to your question, the informal sector is doing something already, and we must build on that. And that any policy that do not factor in building on what informal sector is doing is actually duplicating efforts, because duplication of effort is the biggest operational risk that do exist in the African continent. And what I'm arguing, and I'll keep arguing this, is that the informal sector is the economic locomotive, is the transformational turbocharger for climate action in Africa. And ignoring them is actually ignoring climate resilient building.
Moving on, Doctor, when we look at the commitments that are being made to African countries as far as the fight against climate change is concerned, it's mostly about technical, about financial and capacity building support. Are these forms of support to the fight against climate change effective on the African continent? Or do you think that it's time for Africa to have its own solutions based on local realities?
Your house is on fire and you wait for your neighbor to come and put it off. By the time they will come to put off that fire, your house will be ashes. What does this mean? You have to start playing your part as you wait for others to come and support you, to start throwing fire to put out that fire before it gets to the worst stage. And by the time you play your part, maybe others will come and support you. This analogy I'm using today plays same to the changing climate. Droughts, people are already dying today. Floods, people are already dying today. Tomorrow, children will not be able to even have food. They're not even sure they're going to live the next 2 or 3, 4 days. So Africa is a house on fire, and we need to start putting it out using what we have. What that means is that, of course, if you look at the NDCs, the climate action plans of the entire African continent, over 80% of all of them are externalized, what is called conditional NDCs. And that means that Africa have actually externalized their transformational climate action development. And that's dangerous. Is it legitimate? Of course, they don't have the resources, and it is fair that those who have caused the problem, the developed world, fund them. But it's just good to learn from history. That if you look at the 100 billion that was promised in 2009 till today, what has come to the continent is just above 20 billion. But this 20 billion has not even actually come to build adaptation. And therefore, if you are to wait this long, for almost about 14 years, with 20 billion coming out of the 100 billion that was supposed to be contributed each and every year, it's just fair to say that Africa needs to start looking internally. Am I saying that Africa should not accept or look for external support? Absolutely not. But Africa is a house on fire. Start putting out the fire. Leverage the little resources that you have, the taxes that you collect, and start creating these blended finance facilities to incentivize local actors, the young people who are creating opportunities and enterprises to access little finance to start building their own climate action businesses in a way, to start supporting our mothers in communities who are doing in their own way, cultivating and using nature-based solutions, to start having simple tools to add value like solar dryers, to start assessing briquettes made from agricultural waste. So the point is that without building resilience with the little we have and waiting only for external support, when the trajectory of support coming to Africa has not actually materialized at the speed and the urgency with which this issue demands, is like throwing water on a duck's back.
The fight against climate change has been echoed all across the continent, but it's also coming at a time when Africa has one major drawback in its development, which of course is conflict. We do have conflicts across the African continent, Eastern DRC, in Libya, in Cameroon, in the Horn of Africa, not leaving out the Sahel region where jihadis and coup d'etats are also drawing back the efforts about development. How is this affecting the fight against climate change?
The reality is that conflict has been linked to climate change. If you look in the Sahel, what has actually shown a correlation, conflict and climate change, very strong correlation, means that people give up when they cannot find alternatives. The young people are getting into terrorist groups, Al-Shabaab, whether we're talking other terrorist groups in the Sahel, because they don't have alternatives. And then they're being lured into this because they're idle. So the answer is, with climate change, we will see more conflict. Why? Competition for scarce resources. If you take Lake Chad, that has shrunk today to a level never ever seen before. That means livelihood of populations in northern Cameroon, in Chad, in northern Nigeria, and others that share the Lake Chad basin area will be affected because livelihoods in terms of those who are depending on fishery have shrunk. Livelihoods in terms of those who are depending on the water there for irrigation and others have been limited. And when you look at this, what does that mean? They don't have alternatives. And then they look for other aspects that they can be able to be involved to put food on the table and potentially ending up in these terrorist groups and or fighting over one another because of this limitation of resources. And therefore, with the changing climate, with the increase in temperature, we're going to see worse than what we are seeing today in the continent. And the answer lies back in what I said, seeing the opportunities to create opportunities for young people, to guide them, to retool their skills so that they can become climate action renewers, as I call it, in doing simple things like turning agricultural waste to fuel briquettes. That's a huge business. An over 20 billion US dollars business in just replacing charcoal business with fuel briquettes. That's a lucrative business to tap into, or tap into that growth value chain. That is worth 48 billion US dollars just in post-harvest losses. Developing solar dryers, young people will get into this pathway. Or we're talking about a simple opportunity like biofertilizer, where the market is increasing at a 5.9% rate every year, and actually still yet the production in the continent is low to replace chemicalized fertilizers. And so leveraging climate action opportunity is the best way to reduce conflicts, because opportunities will be created and reduce the fight over limited resources.
Dr. Richard Munang, you are the Deputy Regional Director of the United Nations Environmental Program for Africa, and of course, this body has been on the ground to implement the fight against climate change with several programs scattered across the continent. What has the United Nations Economic Program been doing on the African continent in particular to make climate action a visible reality on the part of the local population?
The UN Environment Program is leveraging on the very simple logic that climate action is an investment opportunity. It's a business opportunity. And what we have done through our work is that in every facet of our work, we have bringing you to be able to tap into very simple climate action solutions. For example, in Uganda, leveraging on a framework that we created called Ecosystem-Based Adaptation for Food Security Assembly, and a tool that we created called Innovative Volunteerism, which is very simple, that the work we do, because UNEP's work is knowledge for policy. science generated to inform policy actions to drive transformational environmental solutions. That within this, that knowledge is actually leveraged and youth are guided to use that knowledge in simple climate action solutions. And we're guiding them to turn agricultural waste into fuel briquettes. And this is replacing charcoal in households. We're seeing millions of them across the continent doing so, to Nigeria, to Cameroon, to Togo, to Southern African region, Zambia, Zimbabwe. All these, we are guiding them. But we're also trying to ensure that guiding them is one aspect, but ensuring that this knowledge that is coming out of the actions they're doing need to be integrated to school curriculum. UN Environment Program is working with academic institutions. For example, in Nigeria, in Nasarawa State University, KEFI, the first climate action entrepreneurship curriculum in the entire continent has been created to be able to not only train young people to understand the inherent opportunities that come with climate action, but to make them climate action entrepreneurs so that when they come out of school, they will be getting to create their businesses that are climate resilient. They'll be able to develop solar dryer. They'll be able to turn agricultural waste into fuel briquette. It's the same thing that has happened in Bayesago University in Botswana, where the Climate Action Center has been created and students and even people from outside, like businesses, private citizens, are coming in to take courses to understand exactly what climatepreneurship means. And therefore, putting this within the vision of national development through education curriculum is actually an opportunity not only to get youth prepared, but also to create the manpower, the skill sets that are needed to tap opportunities in a changing climate that is making the world more dangerous. Another is the adaptation gap report, which shows the gap we have to close, institutional gap, policy gaps, financial gaps that have to be closed to be able to ensure that resilience of communities is built. And actually, what the report shows is that Africa needs between 5 to 10% increase in financial flows to be able to close the gaps, and an investment of up to about 500 billion US dollars if we were to reduce temperatures below 2 degrees to 1.5 by 2030. And therefore, this science help inform the action that need to be taken to create opportunities for the youth, and at the same time combining with the operational guidance that we're giving the youth across the continent.
Now, I would like to take you to one of your books which you wrote, which contains volunteerism. In that book, you cited clearly that volunteerism is an effective tool to boost economic development in Africa and also to boost the youth's potentials in the fight against climate change. But I'm more focused on the word innovative volunteerism. What is it all about, and what role can it play in this global crusade against climate change?
Without bringing in everyone and using what we call the whole of society approach, we will not be able to build climate resilience or address climate change, especially in the African continent. Let's face it, 1.4 billion people, lack of opportunities, 1.4 billion people in a continent that actually suffer drought and floods, but at the same time need over 50 billion US dollars to be able to address climate change if the world was to hit 2 degrees, which we are today already over 1.1 degree. A continent where the financial resources that are needed each and every year to adapt to climate change is between 12 to 17 billion US dollars. Where will this money come from when for about 14 years, only 20 billion has come? That's money that is just for 1 year, but it's come over 14 years. It therefore means that we need to be innovative and start to see how we can leverage on skills and talents of everyone to be able to tap into passions of people to turn passions into profits. And you can only do this by encouraging and engaging people to voluntarily volunteer themselves to tap into the opportunities that are inherent in climate challenges. And that's the essence of innovative volunteerism, that people can be guided and inspired to retool their skills, to turn their passions to profits by using those skills to learn a simple trade, like turning agricultural waste into fuel briquettes, like fabricating a simple solar dryer, but doing so in the course of addressing a problem, also making a profit. And the innovativeness is that problems are solved. And they can only be solved when we voluntarily volunteer ourselves. So the place of innovative volunteerism in the climate change fight in Africa is central stage. Why? Because Africa will not have all the resources it needs to build climate resilience. But Africa do have people, especially her youth, who are over 60% of the population, and most of them don't have jobs. Government will not be able to create jobs for all the youth. It has never happened anywhere in the world. But opportunities could be created that government can come in to facilitate and create enabling environment. Imagine if all the money came to Africa today, do the young people have the skills to be able to tap to that? The answer is no. What if the young people voluntarily volunteer themselves through this period of innovative volunteerism that we are driving across the continent? We're seeing young people in Uganda who are turning agricultural waste into fuel briquettes. In Cameroon, we're seeing young people who are trained to turn agricultural waste into biofertilizer.
As someone that has been to rural communities in Africa to see the effects of climate change as well as propose solutions, what practical solutions can we have in a bid to keep climate change effects at bay and ensure that communities get the best in their local day-to-day living?
First policy incentive the government needs to incentivize youth to take up climate action solutions, first of all, is to integrate climate action into every school curriculum so that it becomes part and parcel of national development. Once that is done, the young people will start seeing opportunities as they are going through school, primary, secondary, high school. Climate action solutions must be compulsory and must be integrated into the curriculum. The second is government should give tax breaks to every youth that is engaged in a climate action activity. The young people who are turning agricultural waste to fuel briquettes and they have businesses should be given tax breaks. And what does that mean? They should not pay taxes if they are contributing to driving climate action for a certain number of time, like 5 years. Just like the Cameroon government actually did something that was applauded across the continent today, which is reducing taxes and excess duties on solar energy equipment and tools into the country. That's what can also be done for youth who are carrying out climate action opportunities, who are developing solar dryers, who are turning agricultural waste into biofertilizer. Those initiatives that they're dealing with, they should be incentivized. The third is government should develop a blended finance facility, little money set aside to be given to cooperatives and to Njangis who are carrying out these actions or who can be able to loan out to youth at zero interest rate to be able to carry out these climate action solutions. The fourth one is we need incentives beyond just what I call the hard incentives. We need soft incentives, inspiration, and passion. We must start to inspire one another and write that we all have a hand and a role to play in climate change, that we can be able to leverage on our passions and start teaching one another in churches, in schools, in our homes, that we must leverage on our passion and become purposeful, because the changing climate, when there's a flood, it does not only affect few people, it affects everybody. When there's a drought, it affects everybody. And therefore, we will see that interconnectedness in each and every one of us and start to inspire one another to become part of the solution, not part of the problem, and start using what we have wherever we are. Like what we are doing today, journalists discussing a climate challenge issue. That is what we must all do, whether it is a teacher, a journalist, a physicist like myself, environmentalist like myself. We should all have these conversations in our community, family, and everywhere. And that takes passion. So we must develop passion. And this is something that is underlooked. And however, if it is woven into government policy, into individual way of doing things, we can see that we can be able to move forward in a very fast way. And the last aspect is government should not tax the youth who are on the trajectory of doing something that drive climate action solutions. It should inspire them, train them, and at the same time, also ensure that little resources are provided through structures in which they can access.
Doctor, we are living at a time when most African economies are facing shocks from the COVID-19 pandemic. They are also facing shocks from the Russian-Ukraine war. And we know that the development indices is being hinged on the gross domestic product. Do you think that it's time to re-strategize Africa's economic policy towards a climate action prism? And if yes, what advantages can that have on the economies of African countries?
The best way to do this is that the classical economic policy that was premised on only GDP doesn't work anymore, because GDP is not going to be sustainable under the changing climate. It's going to be what we call productive economies now, where each and everyone benefits as a result of the actions that are happening wherever they are. Because GDP misses are the bulk of the population. That a mother in a village in southern Nigeria or in northern Cameroon or in eastern Cameroon or in the northwest part of the country doesn't have access to finance will be regarded as if she is on a per capita income of $400 a year. It's not true. So the point is that the economic model under the changing climate is that every action that is done when it comes to budgeting, every action must be linked to climate action solution. For example, when we take clean energy, it must be about development, and the development means that the off-grid, over 65% of people in Africa who don't have access to electricity, solar energy is the easiest off-grid that can be able to reach them. When investments are put on that, that will drive economic growth, because that electricity will provide light and at the same time could be used to add value. That's the model of economic. So economic model that needs to be used to grow and transform Africa is actually a climate model. And therefore, good climate policy is good economic policy. That agricultural production cannot just be about using fertilizers. It needs to move away from chemicalized fertilizer to biofertilizer and organic fertilizer. And that any budgetary allocation should then go to support these environmental friendly solutions. And that taxes being taxed on initiatives that are green climate driven initiatives should actually be waived so that those can be brought to scale. And that any economic formula without climate action in it, in terms of the actions on the ground, is wrong economic policy. And so overarchingly, to answer your question, climate action is an investment opportunity. And all investments to drive economic transformation of the country must be seen through the climate lens. That means moving away from fossil fuel driven kerosene, petrol, to now biogas driven, briquettes driven, and of course, solar power, wind driven. And that investment will drive opportunities for people both in urban and rural areas.
Now, at the level of Cameroon, where you come from, how can you evaluate Cameroon's fight against climate change? Is it really effective?
Cameroon is a leader in Central African region. We cannot ignore reality. Cameroon revised their nationally determined contributions to reduce emission by 35% that are conditional and by 12% that are unconditional. That's leadership. And in that revision of their nationally determined contribution plan, the climate plan, they are actually having in it a very strong, robust aspect, which is to ensure that biodigesters are decentralized to communities. That's very, very effective and excellent, because it's a job creating opportunity. It's a way to reduce the waste that are cluttered in our communities. And that can be able to provide electricity through biogas. It can be able to provide biofertilizer that will be used to replace chemicalized fertilizer that depreciate government results in importing chemicalized fertilizer that result to higher emissions and destroy our soils. The big thing, which is similar to other countries, is turning Cameroon climate action plan into implementation. And what needs to happen is what I said earlier, which is that the young people in the country who are carrying out some of these activities, which the UN Environment Program is helping guide some of these through working with the Ministry of Environment and other non-state actors like ADEIT, which is the driver of some of the clean energy solutions in Cameroon, and training young people to be able to take this to the next stage. What needs to happen is that the data coming out of these simple actions that are coordinated and driven by state and non-state actors in the country at small scale should then be used to inform policy making, to give incentives to young people who are willing to do so. And that way, climate action solutions in Cameroon will be brought to scale and more people will lift out of poverty. Here is logic and reason that is more urgently needed in driving transformational climate action for Cameroon and Africa. Because the truth is this, the challenges of Cameroon on climate change are almost the same like the challenges of other African countries.
All right, Dr. Richard Munang, before we go, can you please tell us the programs which the UN Environmental Program has rolled out for the year 2023 as it continues the tough fight against climate change, where severe weather conditions continue to wreak havoc on the African continent? What programs should we be expecting this year?
Yeah, the United Nations Environment Program is a knowledge for policy institution providing cutting-edge science to inform the best environmental action that needs to be taken to build a resilient world. And what the United Nations Environment Program focuses on is to continuously leverage nature solutions to drive not only resilience building, but to ensure that our ecosystems are intact, our waters, our rivers, our oceans are intact. And these bringing knowledge and cutting-edge science to inform policy so that these actions are taken in a way that create opportunities. It's also climate action solutions like those that we've discussed, continuously inspire countries to put legislation in place. At the same time, also showcasing what practically can be done to build resilience at the community level and leveraging structures of government, individual citizens, civil societies, NGOs, and the informal sector especially, to ensure that at least actions that they take, the data can actually feed back to inform policy, and to ensure that pollution and waste can actually become center stage, where, as I said earlier, 700,000 Africans die every year as a result of indoor pollution, demonstrating practically how actions on the ground can be taken and how those actions data can help inform policies to provide incentives. This is what the United Nations Environment does. And so through addressing the triple planetary crisis of climate change, of biodiversity loss, of pollution and waste, the driving actions of climate action, nature action, pollution action, woven within support to government, within leveraging on the UN country teams in countries, and at the same time, ensuring that the youth are the central pillar in these actions is actually what we'll be focusing on, and bringing lessons from other countries, cross-hybridizing them with other countries, showcasing practically what can be done, and showing all these things through the lens of investment opportunities so that socioeconomic solutions can actually drive transformational business opportunities for people and planet.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Richard Munang. Thank you very much for talking to us. We're indeed very grateful.
Thank you very much, Peter, for having me. It's a great pleasure, and it's been an amazing time talking to you on Dash TV. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you very much, Doctor. And of course, that was Dr. Richard Munang, the Deputy Regional Director of the United Nations Environmental Program in charge of Africa, there on the program. Thank you very much for being with us in this edition of In-Depth. Until next time, it's goodbye from Douala. Keep watching Dash News.